So we've been in Monterey for a while, and the city has really drastically changed my opinion of Mexico and Mexicans. It's a beautiful city. In fact, it's the most Americanized city in Mexico. That's not necessarily why I like it, but it does make it very comfortable and familiar for me. Let's be honest, the perception of Mexico and Mexicans in the United States can often be negative. That's why my opinion was so drastically changed when I actually got here and had the opportunity to experience the culture itself. As of 2012, 17% of the total US population has been Hispanic. A lot of that is concentrated in the American Southwest, with New Mexico at 47% of its population being Hispanic and all of the other southwestern states being at least 25%. So this all goes back to the time when this territory, the American Southwest, used to belong to Mexico, and many people forget that. Mexico was twice the size as it is today, but all of that territory was acquired by the United States after the Mexican-American War, also known as the United States invasion of Mexico. The war itself started in 1846 and went on to 1848. Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, and included in its territory was California, Texas, and everything in between, which was known as New Mexico. And those were territories, but the rest of the country was basically states. So the territories had less representation in the central government. Mexico abolished slavery very quickly in its nationhood, but it was a largely unequal government and country because the more European descent you had and the less indigenous descent you had, basically the more power and prominence and freedom and opportunity and rights you were given. Mexico had experienced a lot of instability in the following years. It had over 30 leadership changes between its nationhood and the war, which was only 25 years later. It had 4 different types of government and many rebellions. In fact, 12 of its states rebelled in 1835, which was just 14 years after it had become an independent country, when Santa Anna, the president at the time, replaced the Constitution with a more dictatorial government. California and Texas, which were territories, rebelled. Yucatan rebelled, and Texas and Yucatan were the only ones who were actually successful. But many of the states closer to Mexico City also rebelled. It is also worth noting that when the war finally did come about, only 7 of the 19 Mexican states contributed men, weapons, and funds for the defense of the country. In 1837, there was a revolt in New Mexico as well. So all 3 of the territories that were taken over eventually by the United States had rebellions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they wanted to ultimately depart from the government. They were just against the new changes, though there was a general large sentiment on the border territories that they really enjoyed that freedom that they had in being on the border. And they also did not have a lot of inhabitants. California only had about 7,000 Mexican inhabitants at the time of the war. Some of the reasons why they were so against the central government was that they first of all, they lacked representation in the government. They had less than the central states, but they also lacked protection from Indian hostility, and they just basically received little benefit from the government while being restricted in these several ways. In Texas, you had to convert to Catholicism to migrate there and also pay taxes, but there was a huge problem of Indian raids in the territory. So Mexico actually encouraged the United States citizens to migrate there to help protect and develop the land. And this fit quite well because the United States at the time was experiencing great prosperity. It was burgeoning in its economy, and there was just a far greater population than in Mexico. So many people in the United States were looking for new lands to settle, and they were going west. In fact, in California, Sutter's Fort near San Francisco was primarily populated by American immigrants. There was just a great interest at the time of Americans moving west, and Mexicans couldn't necessarily compete in the long term for their potential to settle and expand. So in the centralization and federalist reforms in Mexico and all the territories really not liking that, Texas was one of them, and being majority comprised of former United States citizens, they eventually rebelled and were successful in repelling all of the Mexican re-invasions of that territory to try to take it back. They finally regained their independence in 1836, 15 years after Mexican independence and 10 before the Mexican-American War. This happened when the president Santa Anna invaded Texas and was captured by the Texans. So the very president of the country of Mexico could not defeat this territory. And he signed an armistice treaty with Texas, which the Mexican government did not recognize. So Texas officially declared itself an independent nation, but Mexico did not recognize that. And the United States decided to annex Texas 8 years later, which is something that Texas had been wanting for quite some time. So this really angered the Mexican government because it was putting the United States government even closer to their border and threatening that the United States would potentially even annex more territory. This definitely made them a little bit uneasy. So though the Mexicans were concerned about the encroaching American territory on their border, the United States was actually concerned that Britain and France would annex California because of how weak the control of the Mexican government over that territory was. And of course, the United States had the Monroe Doctrine, which was to prevent European powers in holding land on the continent. And they also had Manifest Destiny, which was a philosophy that they should connect the country from Atlantic to Pacific. President Polk of the United States, who wanted to enter into a war with Mexico, he sent troops into disputed land in what is now Texas and put them in harm's way where the Mexicans fired on them. And then the United States declared war on Mexico when the president made a statement that Mexico, past the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood on American soil. So that gave him the reason to start the war, even though he was putting them in disputed land. It is also made obvious that one of the primary reasons why the United States entered into this war was to help promote slavery, as many of the Northerners and Republicans were against the war, but many of the Southerners and Democrats were for it. The Democrats being the party of slavery at the time, who wanted to gain more Southern territory going west, in which slavery would be legal. So Abraham Lincoln was opposed to the war. He made a speech to Congress against President Polk for not being able to prove where the war started. And he said, if he cannot or will not do this, if on any pretense or no pretense he shall refuse or admit it, then I shall be fully convinced of what I more than suspect already, that he is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he feels the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying to heaven against him. Kind of laying out how President Polk has been really wishy-washy on the actual reasons for why we should be engaged in this war, and really wanted proof that the war was just, which he really didn't believe could be given to him. Henry David Thoreau famously was imprisoned as a result of this war because he did not want to support the war in paying his taxes. I also want to make special note that while there was a dispute over which country should control that land, a lot of that land was still controlled by huge tribes of Indians, namely the Comanche and the Puebla Indians, and they were not consulted in who should be sovereign over them. Mexico was a very mixed society in which a large portion of the population was either mestizo or indigenous, and only a portion of it was European, whereas in the United States, generally the policy was Europeans and Indians being separated, and eventually what we have now being the Indian reservations. Separation instead of mixing. The Mexican population often reflected some of the historical heirs to the land of the indigenous people a little bit better than the United States did. We should not forget that the American Indians of the United States are cousins to the indigenous peoples of Mexico, and they did not necessarily see a border, they did not like to see a border, but now what we have here is a hard drawn line where these peoples who may have been related to somebody on the other side of the border and may have experienced freedom of movement before are now being told by these sovereign nations that they must stick to one side or the other, at least as citizens, even though there was a lot of trade continuing to go back and forth between the two nations before and since the war. Once the war did start, it was decisively in the favor of the United States, which had the superior military, and the United States won the war ultimately. In consequence, the United States forgave all of the Mexican debt, which was about $3 million towards American citizens, and paid Mexico $15 million, but took half of their territory, took all of the territories that are in what is now the United States, the California, Texas, and New Mexican territories. The United States justified the taking of this land because of the debt owed and because of the cost of the war, but really it was just kind of something that they had always wanted. The United States had made many attempts to purchase the territories prior to the war, so this is just something that they just wanted, and the war gave them the opportunity to take it. Nicholas Trist, who was the one who negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, said that if the Mexicans could know what his heart looked like in that moment, they would see how that he was far more ashamed claimed as being an American than the Mexicans. And so as a result of this war, the United States took over all of that territory, and many of the people living in the territories that were taken over were, they were really against both the rule of Mexico and of the United States. They really enjoyed their freedom. There was not a massive amount of bloodshed, but there was a revolt in New Mexico, the Taos Revolt, which was decidedly crushed by the United States Army. And the treaty promised U.S. citizenship to the former Mexican citizens who wanted the citizenship. But as we can still see today, Mexicans in the lands were often treated poorly. It was far worse at the time than it is now. After the war was over, many Anglo-Americans moved in to the new territories acquired by the United States. The former Mexicans living there were treated as second-class citizens. In many cases, there's a lot of evidence for that. In fact, between 1880 and 1930, Mexicans were lynched almost as frequently as African Americans. We often think that there's a huge immigration influx from Mexico to the United States, but in fact, that is no longer the case, as between 2009 and 2014, there has been actually 140,000 more people migrating from the United States to Mexico than from Mexico to the United States. Now, before that, there was a long trend of the opposite, but we are actually seeing a decline in Mexican immigration. And some of the reasons for that is there are many more Mexicans feeling that the quality of life in the two countries is very similar, or maybe even better in Mexico. And in my experience, that has really been the case. This is a fantastic country. It has its own set of issues, but it is a beautiful place with beautiful people and a fast-growing economy. But the negative perception remains in the United States. What I would recommend is that we take into account that the United States, it could very easily be argued that the United States took this territory in an imperialistic fashion, and that should humble us that the way the United States government treated the Indians and treated the Mexicans in that time does not give us the right to judge Mexicans immigrating into the United States as harshly as we often do. Who's to say that we deserve this land any more than they do, they being peoples far more closely in their descent to the original people inhabiting the land. Did you like that? A little different from my regular stream of travel episodes. I just got more and more interested in as I studied it. I also used 2 songs from Mexican composers of the time period of the Mexican-American War. And in honor of the land lost by Mexico, the final song is done by a Spanish artist from New Mexico. So thank you, Nacha, for letting me use your song, Corazon, Cansado. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments, and if you're satisfied with the channel, subscribe. Our next video is the final travel video of Monterey. I can't wait to see you there.